Yeah, we're getting it started right now. We're just having a little bit of problems there. Should be showing. Is it showing?
I don't know where to look.
Nothing.
Oh, here it is. There go.
It,
It's going down.
it's going
I
now,
forgot to
right?
press go live. Okay, now it is.
Okay. Um,
So all your comments will be coming
right here.
there. So don't do anything.
Okay.
So
All right. Later.
Yep. That's how it's coming out. Just know that it's delayed a bit.
All right.
That's what's showing to them.
Okay.
There.
Okay. Hatito Niwikana. My name is Jeremy Turner, and we're going to go ahead and get started on this live stream. We're going to go ahead and get started on this live stream video tonight on the history of the Shawnee people. And with that said, I'll just say a little bit about myself. As I said, my name is Jeremy Turner, and I am an enrolled citizen of the Shawnee tribe. I'm also a descendant of the Seneca, Cayuga, and Wyandotte nations. And tonight we're going to be talking again about the Shawnee, past, present, and future. And so we'll start, and I'll go through the PowerPoint presentation. And then at the end of the PowerPoint presentation, I'll go ahead and take questions for 15 minutes. And then after that, we'll go ahead and end the presentation from there. So with that said, I'd like to say Nyahweh to Rachel Barber for asking me to do this presentation for everyone tonight. And I'm grateful to her for reaching out to me. Thank you to Steve Warren. Thank you to Steve Warren for mentioning my name to Rachel, and I appreciate that. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started with this PowerPoint presentation. All right. All right, so let's first start off. Okay, let's first start off with the name Shawnee, which is the kind of the modern day name that everyone uses, but more appropriately among the Shawnee people, we would say Shawanwa. So I would say Nila Shawanwa, like I am a Shawnee, basically. And that roughly translates in the Shawnee language as warm or moderate weather, which has been also taken to basically mean Southerners, people from the South. So we were known as the southern most portion of the Algonquin speaking people. And we're members of the Algonquin language family groups. And there have been various other historical spellings of Shawnee by different European sources. And you'll see that on historic maps and in historic documents. And so I've also listed a few of the other spellings of Shawnee that you may encounter. So just know that when you see these different spellings, that they're still talking about the same people, the Shawnee people. Okay, so you may see Shawanons, Shawan, Savannah, Shawano. Those are all the same as as Shawnee or Shawanoa. Okay, next slide. All right, our next slide, we're gonna basically discuss the beginnings of the Shawnee people from what we understand as our beginnings. And this goes back to pre-contact, prior to European contact. And the Shawnee people are members or descended from what archaeologists have termed the Fort Ancient people, and which are a group of people that basically built mound containing towns along the Ohio River Valley, and they occupied the Ohio River Valley since what we would say time immemorial, or the beginning of time. With that said, that among those villages, there were 5 divisions among the Shawnees, and you can see on this slide, I've listed those 5 divisions, and the first division would be called the Chillicothe or Chillicothe, also known as Chillicothe, and you maybe see that on maps in Ohio as Chillicothe, but that roughly translated means the first man. And the reason that was called first man, it has to do with a little bit of our creation stories, but the head chief usually of all of the Shawnee people was chosen from this division, this Chillicothe division. The next division would have been Thawikela, or also known as the elder brother, and this has also been said from traditional Shawnee people that the head chief could also be chosen from this division for all of the Shawnee people. Third division is a Kispokatha, and usually or always the head war chief was chosen from this division of the Shawnee people. The next division would have been a Mikoche or Mikoche, you may see sometimes on maps, and the ceremonial leader was chosen from this division. The last division would have been the Pikawitha, or also translated as man coming out of ashes, and the speaker for the head chief was chosen from this division, and that's why that term man coming out of ashes. That ashes is a reference to what we would consider what's known as the council fire, and all business is conducted with that fire near it, and so that's what the significance of the man coming out of ashes as being the speaker, because he's going to be the one, speaking near that fire, using that fire to communicate with the Creator, as we say. With that said, I'd also like to kind of go back to why the Shawnee are linked to the Fort Ancient community, or what the archaeologists call Fort Ancient people. And that goes back to one of our creation stories. One of our creation stories that was passed down, and it was actually recorded by one of the Shawnee chiefs by the name of Blackhoof, basically says that we are descended from who we call our grandmother, and that grandmother appeared basically just on the south, in the south area of Lake Erie, on the south shore of Lake Erie, or in the Ohio River Valley, and that Kokumtha appeared basically holding the tail of what is known as the underwater panther. Okay, so that's why there's going to be on the top of my borders, you'll see the 3 Shawnee communities. Our flags, our tribal flags are attached up there, and on that one flag, you'll see a panther on that flag, and that's a reference to that creation story. Okay, so next slide. Okay, next we're going to talk about the clan structure. And originally, clan structure was passed down through a patrilineal descent, which is quite a bit different from a lot of other Ohio Valley tribes who are matrilineal descent. And also, I want to take note that the division that you belong to was also historically passed down through patrilineal descent as well from your father. And so with that, these are some of the clans that we use today. The turtle, snake, wolf, which is also known as the Roundfoot clan. So there are other animal names inside of that clan besides just the wolf. And we have the raccoon, we have the deer, which today most people call the horse clan. And it's also known as basically animal with hooves. So it could be name groups in there for elk or buffalo as well. And the next name group or clan that we have is the turkey clan. And it's also known as the things that fly. And in today's, Shawnee people, we also call this clan the chicken clan. And then the last clan would be the rabbit clan. Okay. All right. So with that said, the Shawnee basically are the descendants of the Fort Ancient people, like I was saying earlier. And in this next slide, I basically just wanted to give you a quick reference of where those Fort Ancient towns were located in Ohio. And you can see that these towns are all located on the south side of Lake Erie, and basically like I was saying in reference to that creation story. And you'll see that they're mostly located along the Ohio River, the river valley there. And so in that very central area, the brown shaded area, those are what is known as the Fort Ancient towns. All right. So with that said, we're going to talk about basically from the point of contact on. So now we're going to jump forward to European contact. And at that point in history, the Shawnee people were occupying those Fort Ancient villages. And at that time, we were still following our traditional clan and division structure. And each one of those towns would have been named for that division, one of those divisions that we mentioned earlier, the Micoche, the Chillicothe, or the Tawikela, Quispoco, and that's how those towns were basically laid out. And originally we basically occupied that whole river valley there, and what we start seeing in the archaeological record is as trade goods start to appear in these Fort Ancient towns, it's also at the same time these towns are starting to become depopulated. And there are a few theories on that from archaeologists and other historians. But when you take all of those, hypotheses together, you can kind of put them together and see that basically when the first European contact made it into the Ohio River Valley, which would have been through the trade goods that were passed, the first ones that we find in those Fort Ancient towns are all Spanish type trade goods. And we know that the first Spanish contact or push into the Ohio River Valley is with Hernando de Soto in 1541. And so at the same time that Hernando de Soto and his conquistadors are moving up the Mississippi River Valley and trading with the other native tribes along that corridor, well, that contact is basically harboring exactly what we are seeing and dealing with today with COVID. It's the disease that is born and transferred with this hand-to-hand contact of trade goods and interactions between these Europeans and the first native folks that were living in that area that had no immunity to those diseases that the Spanish were bringing. And so the native communities didn't realize that, along with getting what they would consider these cool trade goods, something new that they had never seen before, they were also getting diseases that were basically going to be doing their best to wipe out their populations. And so that's what happened to these Fort Ancient towns. With these trade goods came these diseases that started depopulating these villages. And so what ends up happening is that, the people, I'm sure they really didn't understand what was causing these diseases, and they could understand that things weren't going well in their communities, and they also knew that there was some really interesting, cool items that were being brought to this continent, or what we would call Turtle Island, by these outsiders, these foreigners. And so what we end up seeing is that the Shawnee people start leaving and vacating those Fort Ancient towns and moving closer to the southeast to be in closer contact with these Spanish folks, so that they could actively engage in more trade with them. And also what we see is around that same time is these villages that are being depopulated by diseases and also by the movement of the Shawnee people to the southeast. That these towns are basically being raided by some of the Iroquois communities from New York and Canada border area, and they are taking advantage of the weakness of the Shawnees because of the obviously the interaction with the Europeans and the diseases. And basically, what some historians and archaeologists have found is that at the time that the Iroquois began raiding into those towns, really there were only three Fort Ancient towns that were actually occupied at that time. So when the Iroquois came down, they were only meeting, the basically resistance of three different communities. And so by that time, the rest of the Shawnees had already moved to the southeast. And so you can understand that these weakened towns and most of their families and relatives had already moved to the southeast to be closer to the trade. And now they have other Native American communities coming down from the north and raiding them. Then that would cause them to go ahead and leave the Ohio River Valley as well and move further south with the rest of their community. So at the earliest writings of a lot of these Europeans, they started mentioning seeing Shawnees in the southeast, especially along what's in Georgia called the Savannah River, which, as I said earlier in a slide, is just another name or a corruption of Shawano or Shawanwa. And so this is a lot of Shawnee towns were down along the Savannah River. We were also down the Mississippi River Valley, Louisiana area, and intermingled among our relatives and our longtime allies, the Uchis and the Creeks and Cherokees in the southeast. One interesting thing about the Shawnees being in the southeast is when they were actively engaging in this trade, one of the things that was driving that trade for the Spanish is that they were looking for slave labor. And at that time, African Americans had not been brought over here to this continent as slaves. And so they basically, the Spanish and other Europeans began taking natives as the first slaves and using them as slave labor. And so the Shawnees basically took advantage of that want of human, slaves for the Spanish, and they began raiding other southeastern Native American towns, especially among the Catawba. And they raided those Catawba towns, took prisoners, and then brought them to the Spanish to sell them to the Spanish as slave labor. And in return, we're getting trade goods for that. So the Shawnees were involved. I mean, it's something that we have to own today. They were involved in that first slave trade. Okay. Next slide. All right, as I said, the earliest accounts of the Shawnee by the Europeans in the 1600s place us in the southeast along the Savannah River, and we're occupying multiple villages throughout the southeast, actively engaged in raiding other southeastern tribes, especially the Catawbas. By the 1690s, there are groups of Shawnee that are occupying villages in Old Town, Maryland. That's the first time that we start seeing accounts that describe Shawnees living in Maryland in the 1690s. Okay, the interesting thing about the Shawnee people is that we like to travel, obviously, as you'll see from the rest of this presentation. And we spent a lot of time moving around, and the Shawnee are documented as having homes and villages in 26 out of the 48 contiguous states. Okay, so next slide. again, as I said, by the early 1690s, a lot of the southeastern Shawnee communities are moving up the East Coast, and they're ending up in Maryland. Some of those communities among the Cherokees and the Uchis are moving into the Cumberland River Valley of Tennessee and Kentucky at that same time. And then also some of the Shawnees are starting to come back up the Mississippi River into the edge of Missouri and Illinois around St. Louis, and starting to be allied with the French at that time, right around the 1690s, right at the turn of the 1700s. So by the late 1690s, the groups of Shawnees that had moved into Old Town, Maryland, they started moving further up the Susquehanna River Valley, and that was because of European encroachment from the East Coast. The Shawnees that moved from Old Town, Maryland up the Susquehanna River, they basically move in among another community of people that had amalgamated together from various groups that had fled the East Coast, like the Piscataway, the Nanticoke, the Conoy, and also other groups from the southeast, the Tutelo, the Saponi, the Nottoway. They had all fled basically Virginia and North Carolina and came up to the Susquehanna River Valley, and basically all moved in surrounding the main town known as Shamokin. And Shamokin, again, was basically a community of amalgamated tribes. And that community began to be known as what historians call the Mingo people. And the Mingo, like I said, were just the remnants of Nanticokes, Conoys, Piscataway, Tutelo, Saponi, and Nottoway from the east and the south, along with the Susquehannock people that had already lived there. And then also every one of the Six Nations from the Iroquois Confederacy in New York were also living in and among that community of Shamokin. And so the Shawnees that moved from Old Town, Maryland, moved into that river valley and founded their towns very near Shamokin and all around different branches of the Susquehanna River Valley, along with some of the Delawares that had been forced out of New Jersey and Delaware as well. During that time, other groups of the Shawnees had remained in the southeast, like I had said earlier, and their towns were near Uchee Creek and Cherokee allies, as I had mentioned. By the beginning of the 1700s, the Shawnees began returning to the Ohio River Valley. And the Wyandot, we have an oral tradition that was recorded by a anthropologist or an ethnologist out in Kansas in the 1840s, I believe, or 1850s, excuse me, I believe it was. And that oral account states that there were a group of Wyandot families that were hunting right at the mouth of what is known as the folks in Ohio today, modern day Ohio, they mispronounce this river valley. They call it the Scioto River Valley, but that is not the proper name for that river. It's more appropriately called Skinoto, which is actually a Wyandot word, and it means the deer river. So Skinoto River got corrupted into Scioto River, which is now corrupted into Scioto. So those are all the same river, but as I said, the appropriate name is Skinoto. And so this group of Wyandots are camped at the mouth of the Skinoto or Scioto River, right at the border of Kentucky and Ohio, near where Portsmouth, Ohio is today. And they see a group of Indians that they do not recognize coming up the Ohio River in canoes. Excuse me. They hail to those Indians to come ashore, and when those Indians come and bring their canoes up to the shore of the Ohio bank, they introduce themselves to the Wyandots as Shawnees or Shawanois. and they tell the Shawnee or the Wyandot that they're returning and looking to reestablish themselves in the Ohio River Valley. At that time, the Wyandots say that no one other than themselves uses that river valley for hunting in their winter hunts, because the Wyandot main towns were up at Detroit, in Detroit, Michigan at that time. And so the Wyandotte basically say, move your towns right here in this Scioto River Valley. So the Shawnee do, they build Lower Shawnee Town. What? Why? I'm not answering questions yet. Yeah, I'm gonna show them what books. Sorry, my wife was telling me to answer a question. I'm gonna answer questions at the very end. Okay. So anyway, the Shawnee build their town at Lower Shawnee, what's known as Lower Shawnee Town, or it's also known as Chillicothe, and they build it right there at the mouth of the Scioto River, where it meets the Ohio. As an interesting fact, archaeology that was done on that town actually backs up that oral story, in that the town is founded basically around the first quarter of the 18th century. So basically the early 1700s, that town there at the mouth of the Scioto River is founded, which is really neat, where oral tradition and archaeological record back one another up. Okay. So from there, also other Shawnees that are moving up the river and up from the Cumberland River Valley, they found towns in northern Kentucky, and the main town there is known as Iskipakitiki, which in Shawnee would be translated into the Blue Licks. And this town, or Iskipakitiki, was located near where modern day Boonesboro, Kentucky is. Okay. So next slide. It's not doing it. All right, during the mid 1700s, Shawnee, Delaware, and Mingo continue to get pushed further west from the Shamokin River Valley into western Pennsylvania as a result of the French and Indian War. And it is at this time that the Shawnees earned the title of the greatest travelers in America from Edmund Adkin, who was the Southern Superintendent for Indian Affairs in 1755. So that kind of goes to what I was saying earlier, is that Shawnees are they love to move around. And again, that goes to say that we had those documented villages in 26 of the states, the lower 48 states. All right, next slide. This is a small map of some of the Indian towns in Ohio, and I know it may be kind of hard to read. It's kind of small, but basically I just wanted to show this to kind of give an idea about the movement of the Shawnee towns in Ohio during various periods of history during the 1700s. And so what we see is that the earliest, a lot of the earlier Shawnee towns are back again right on the Ohio River, where the mouth of the Scioto and the mouth of the Miami or Little Miami River are. And what happens is, as time goes on and Europeans are, encroaching more into the Ohio River Valley, those Shawnee towns start removing further upriver on the Scioto River Valley and the Miami River Valley to get away from the Europeans, the British, the French, and later the Americans that are continuously coming up and down the Ohio River and encroaching upon the Native American communities that were living in those towns. And they were, a lot of them, after the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, they were illegally hunting in Kentucky. And so that as a result of that, these towns move further upriver into the heart of, the Ohio state of Ohio today, or the Ohio country, to get a little bit further away from European encroachment. So that's what you see in this map, is that these towns, they're the same. They're the same groups of families, and the towns are named the same, and they're just occupied at different points in history in in the 1700s. Okay. This is a little bit clearer map that you could see of the movements of those towns based on the time frame, and you can see that most of the Shawnee towns in the early 1700s are situated in this Scioto or Scanoto River Valley. And then, as I said in an earlier slide, a lot of those Shawnee communities that were being forced out of Pennsylvania, that had been intermingled with the Mingo and intermarrying with the Mingo, they basically started moving their towns near some of the Delaware towns in the Muskingum River Valley. And so that's what you see on the right-hand side of the map in the 1756, 1774, and those are the mixed band of Shawnees and Mingos that are coming from Pennsylvania. On the left side of the map, you'll see those are a little bit later dates, in 1780s, 1778. Those are where the towns had moved after basically Fort Dunmore's War, and at the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. They had moved up to the Miami River Valley to get a little bit further away from European encroachment. Next slide. So some of the significant wars that had Shawnee involvement were what everybody, most people have heard about. A lot of these wars. The one of the most well known is the French and Indian War, which occurred from 1754 to 1763, and a lot of that war was fought basically in in Pennsylvania and New York. And the Shawnees, basically in the beginning, we were on the side of the French, and then later on at the end of the war, we flipped sides to the British. So after that war was over and was terminated in 1763, basically British folks and British officials took over a lot of the forts in the Ohio River Valley, namely what is today Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. They built a new fort there called Fort Pitt, and they started operating their trading out of that fort, which had previously been known as Fort Duquesne when the French had a fort there. And so once they started operating this trade out of Fort Pitt, immediately they kind of raised the price on all these trade goods out of that fort. And it had a bad effect among the Native American peoples that lived in the Ohio River Valley, in that it made the goods and the items that they relied on, a lot more expensive. And now, because the French had been expelled after losing the war, they did not have two sides to play against each other, and it's like equivalent of modern day being able to go to two different stores and finding the lowest price for something that you want to buy today. Well, because of the loss of France and the French and Indian War, the Native American tribes, and particularly the Shawnee of Ohio, did not have that option of going to another trading post and getting lower priced goods. And so that along with the way that the British were treating the Native allies caused what is also been called Pontiac's uprising in 1763 and 64. And this was basically all of the Native communities in Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan coming together to try to expel the British from their territory, and they attacked all of the forts in that area, and in those areas, as a result of the way they were being treated, not only physically but through trade, and this resulted in what's known as Pontiac's uprising. That war was very short lived, and the native tribes actually lost that war, and as a result, they were forced to sign a treaty with Britain, and a man by the name of Henry Bouquet marched into the Ohio River Valley and brought back a lot of European and African American captives that the Shawnee and other Indian communities had taken during the French and Indian War and Pontiac's uprising. So that was a pretty important part of history, those two wars there. So what you're seeing on these slides, I'll take a minute just to kind of talk about some of the photos that you're seeing on those earlier slides. The one previous slide, those are actually paintings and drawings that are contemporary to the actual 18th century. Those paintings were drawn by artists that actually witnessed those folks, and so they're pretty good looks at what Shawnee or other Native American people in the Ohio River Valley wore and looked like at that time. Along with those paintings, we have a lot of firsthand accounts from journals that describe what our folks look like, and they match up really nicely with those drawings. So kind of like what I was saying earlier, when the archaeological record and the oral tradition kind of come together, it's nice when those firsthand accounts of what the Native people look like and those paintings really match up. All right, this next slide, the next significant wars that happened were what's known as Lord Dunmore's War. That occurred in 1774. And so basically, I had said earlier in that previous slide that 1763 and 64 was Pontiac's uprising, and the peace that was negotiated with Bouquet when he came into the Ohio River Valley, it lasted from 1764 to 1774, and that 10 years was pretty much the longest period of colonial history where it was peaceful in the Ohio River Valley, and that's where the tribes were really trading with the European, or with British officials at Fort Pitt and other trading posts. A lot of English and American traders were working out of the Indian towns in Ohio and being supplied out of Fort Pitt and Fort Detroit at that time. And so it was relatively a time of, that 10-year time of peace and good times for most folks involved, and which brings about the next war known as Dunmore's War, which actually was started when a group of white settlers near the mouth of Yellow Creek murdered a whole group or a whole family of mixed Mingo and Shawnee folks at the mouth of Yellow Creek, and that was known as the massacre of Logan's family at Yellow Creek. That, I believe, there were around 11 of Logan's family that were murdered, and it's a very horrible account. I won't tell everything about it, but there were women, there were babies that were still inside of their mother's womb that were cut out of their womb by these frontiersmen. There were elder women, that were murdered at that frontier cabin known as Baker's Cabin at the mouth of Yellow Creek. And because of that murder of Logan's family, the famous Logan of Ohio also known as John Shikellamy, or sometimes he goes by James Logan. He goes by many names throughout period of history, but he took revenge for the murdering of his family, and what he did was he asked for some other warriors to accompany him, and basically their nearest allies were the Shawnee. And that was the Shawnees of those towns on the Muskingum River Valley that I mentioned earlier, Wakitamike, or as the traders called those towns, Vomit Town. And so Logan and a few Shawnee warriors go out for revenge of his family being murdered there. And that basically coincided with an illegal sale of our lands in Kentucky by the Iroquois Confederacy in 1768, known as the Treaty of Fort Stanwix. The British were able to get the Iroquois, who did not have a claim to Kentucky, because again, the Shawnee were never conquered by the Confederacy, nor did the Iroquois community ever live in Kentucky. As I said, the only documented Indian towns during historical contact were the Shawnee towns in Kentucky. And but anyway, all the Europeans needed was a piece of paper and a title, and in that they found that the Iroquois Confederacy was willing to give that title up, because it kept Europeans from moving into their actual territory of New York. So the Treaty of Fort Stanwix basically gave the Europeans in Virginia all that they needed, and saying that Kentucky is ours and we have a right to start settling it. And with that, people like Daniel Boone and other long hunters started pushing in to Kentucky from the Cumberland Gap. And obviously the Shawnee people that were there hunting and living there did not appreciate that, folks in their hunting grounds poaching their game and all that. So they had been trying to get a peaceful end to that problem, and with the murder of Logan's family, they realized that was not going to happen. So that's what caused them to go ahead and join the Mingo in what's known as Lord Dunmore's War. Okay. So in Dunmore's War, the ultimate culmination of that battle was the Battle of Point Pleasant, which was in West Virginia at the mouth of the Colonial River there. And the Native American Confederacy, unfortunately, was defeated, and there was a treaty that was signed basically between Dunmore and the Shawnee and Seneca Cayuga people. So the next war that happened basically happened the year right after that, and that's the American Revolutionary War. And what happened was, when the American Revolutionary War broke out, the native tribes of Ohio saw that war as a chance to get back at their enemies for Dunmore's War and other wrongs and lands that had been taken from them. And so they used the Revolutionary War to help, get revenge on the Americans and the Virginians and stuff. So these photos that you see on that slide are actually modern day pictures, as you could tell, of some of them are of my family, my son, myself, and then other Shawnee tribal members in various programming that we have done in the last 5 to 10 years. And I'll kind of talk about some of that programming and that cultural outreach that we continue to do. But that's what these photos are taken from, and they're very indicative of how the Shawnee people would have looked during those wars in the 1770s and 80s. So next slide. This is just a map that kind of shows the Ohio country during Lord Dunmore's War. And in the bottom, you could see on this bottom right, you'll see the Blue Ridge Mountains, and then the Cumberland Gap right down there in the bottom center of the screen. And then you can start to see on the left hand side some of the early European settlements like Boonesboro, and then the Shawnee towns that are there further up on the Scioto River Valley. You can see them there on this map as well. Again, like I said earlier, by this time, a lot of the towns had moved upriver away from the Ohio because of this European encroachment into Kentucky. Next slide. Brings us to basically the last two big wars in the East between the Shawnee and the Europeans, and that was known as the Old Northwest Indian Wars, which occurred from 1789 to 1795, culminated with the Treaty of Greenville, and the general by the name of Mad Anthony Wayne marched the American army in there, and the final battle was near Toledo, Ohio, at a place called Fallen Timbers, where the Confederated Indian communities in Ohio were ultimately defeated by the Americans, and which, again, as I said, resulted in the Treaty of Greenville. The next war was basically the War of 1812, or Tecumseh's War, and this war was as a result of the British basically out of Detroit trying to instigate their Native American allies in Ohio and Michigan into engaging in war with the Americans, basically to get back at the Americans for the British loss during the American Revolutionary War. And unfortunately, we see in the War of 1812 a division among the Shawnee people, and it basically became a civil war, really, for the Shawnee people. And on the side, of the British was Tecumseh, which is the correct way to say Tecumseh's name. His actual Shawnee pronunciation would be Tecumseh, and that's the photo that you see on the left there. And then his brother, the Prophet, is on the right in that painting. These are original paintings from the early 1800s, and the Prophet was also known as Tenskwatawa, or the open door is what that would translate as. But Tecumseh was obviously trying to get all of the tribes to ally against the Americans and their encroachment into Ohio. And unfortunately, because of the Treaty of Greenville, the elder Shawnee leaders and majority of the warriors that looked up to them, said that they would never raise their hands against the Americans again after the Treaty of Greenville. So they abided by that, and it caused, like I said, a big rift in the Shawnee people, and so that ended up in Tecumseh and his brother, the Prophet, moving their base of operations from Ohio over into Indiana on the Wabash River at a town known today as Prophetstown. And that was their base of operations during the War of 1812 until Harrison destroyed it in 1811. But at that town, and most people don't realize this, but Tecumseh and his brother, they only had roughly 20 Shawnee families that followed them and sided with them. The main body of Shawnees actually did not side with Tecumseh, and they actually eventually ended up working as scouts or spies for the Americans during that War of 1812 out of Ohio. And but anyway, the majority of the Prophet and Tecumseh's followers were Winnebagos, Sauk and Fox, Potawatomis, basically the tribes that were from Illinois in Michigan and Wisconsin area. Those were the tribes that came down and really backed the brothers during the War of 1812. All right, next slide. So basically, after the War of 1812, it leads us into what's known in Ohio and Missouri as the reservation periods. And basically, the first movements out of Ohio actually occurred right after the Dunmore's War, right after the defeat at Point Pleasant, the Battle of Point Pleasant. There was a group of Shawnees that actually vacated Ohio and went to what is today Cape Girardeau, Missouri, and they did that to get as far away from the American settlers as they could and the Europeans as they could, and so that's what took them out to Missouri. And so that's what you see in this next slide is these towns, these Shawnee towns that were there near Cape Girardeau and even up by St. Louis, all along the Mississippi River Valley, where the Missouri River comes into the Mississippi, and then down, as I said, near Cape Girardeau, you'll see these other Shawnee towns, and on that map you see the towns and roughly the dates that they were occupied. Okay, and so the earliest Shawnee that start moving out of Ohio moved there in 1774, but basically the Shawnee don't get a reservation or a land grant there until 1793, and then 1793 the Spanish, who at that time that area was Spanish territory. Technically, the Spanish granted the Shawnee communities there a land grant around Cape Girardeau in 1793. So at that time, even though those Shawnees were still living there in Missouri and there were still communities in Ohio, there was a lot of travel back and forth and still intermingling and intermarriage and stuff like that. And then in 1825, the Shawnee there at Cape Girardeau in Missouri, they signed a treaty with the American government, basically ceding their lands at Cape Girardeau and exchanging those lands for a reservation in Kansas. Is what happened at the Treaty of 1825. And so on this slide, you also see some paintings of some tribal leaders at that time frame. And two of the guys on this slide that are named, Petakuta, who is also known to the whites as Captain Reed, and Kishkalawa, those were two of the signers of that Treaty of 1825. So next slide. At that time that the Shawnees were out in Missouri, there were still groups of Shawnees that had been forced onto smaller portions after the War of 1812 onto reservations in northwest Ohio. And on this map on the lower left-hand side, you'll see that map showing basically the Indian reservations in northwest Ohio. The ones that we're concerned with are centered around Lewiston or Lewistown. You'll see that on the bottom, kind of the bottom left upper hand of that. And then you also see Wapakoneta and Hog Creek. Those were the three Shawnee reservations in Ohio. And those reservations, the borders of those reservations were laid out in what's known as the Treaty of 1817. And from there, there were three Shawnee communities that operated on those reservations until removal from Ohio in 1831 and 32. And some of the leaders for those areas were these two men that you see on the slide as well. And these are original paintings from the early 1800s. The man in the bottom right is Blackhoof or Katawikasa, and the one on the left is Captain John Lewis, and he's also known, his Shawnee name is Quitawapea. And anyway, that's why Lewistown took that name, because of Captain Lewis that lived there. Again, I was talking about how the Shawnees had split during the War of 1812, and here's two leaders that were examples of that split. Both of these men were, they sided with the Americans during that War of 1812. Okay, next slide. So, with the Treaty of 1831 in Ohio between the Lewistown Shawnees and then the Wapakoneta Shawnees, that forced the Shawnee people out of Ohio and into Missouri and also Kansas, where some of the other Shawnee were starting to move from the Cape Girardeau tract of land. And one group of Shawnees in Ohio went straight from Ohio to basically Oklahoma, the border of Oklahoma and Missouri, Seneca, Missouri. And that group of Shawnees was known as the mixed band of Seneca Shawnees. And that was the Lewistown Shawnees. Okay, so that was the group of Shawnees that had contact with the Mingo people all the way back in Ohio or in Pennsylvania, in those Susquehanna towns near Shamokin. And because of that, that interconnectedness, those families, intermarried and lived together and moved together from Ohio all the way, like I said, to Oklahoma in 1831 and 32. The other Shawnees from Wapakoneta and Hog Creek, they went to Kansas and then eventually went to Missouri and eventually to Kansas, and were there until after the Civil War. After the Civil War was over, basically those Shawnees and Delawares and Wyandottes that were still left in Kansas were forced by the government to leave and go to Oklahoma. And so that's what you're seeing on this slide here, is the removal of the Shawnee tribe from Kansas basically to Oklahoma. And that happened as a result of an agreement in 1869 between the Shawnee and the Cherokee. And that agreement basically made those Shawnees leave Kansas. A majority of the Shawnees left Kansas into Oklahoma and became what's known as adopted Cherokees, or on the Dawes rolls later, they're known as adopted Shawnees. They're adopted into the Cherokee Nation. And so what you see on this slide here, these men, Graham Rogers and Charles Tucker, those were and Captain Joseph Parks, those were some of the men that signed that agreement between the Cherokees and the Shawnees and the American government in 1869, and caused those families to leave Kansas and then to go where our tribal headquarters are occupied in northeastern Oklahoma today. And so that's what that map on the left is kind of laying out. It shows, it's kind of small, I know, but you could probably Google it and find it in a bigger size on the internet if you're truly interested in looking at those reservations. But that map lays out all the different tribal reservations in Kansas, Nebraska territory, and Oklahoma, and shows that movement from Kansas down to Oklahoma. Okay, next slide. So this is a map that I asked our the chairman of our Shawnee Tribe Cultural Preservation Committee, Garrett Couch, to help me put together. And his background is in GIS and map making, and that's what he does for Indian country. And so he was able to use those skills and look at, from a lot of the early documents that we have and written accounts and these treaties, basically try to put this map together just to give an idea of all of the movements of the Shawnees across, the eastern United States into Kansas, and then ultimately into Oklahoma. And so that's what you see on this map here, is those movements. And so you'll see that there are 3 different colors of these arrows on here. And what you see is that at one time, obviously, all the Shawnee people were the same. We were, the descendants of those Fort Ancient people that come from those 5 divisions. And those 5 divisions only work when we are living together, in the Ohio River Valley. But once we were, the first Europeans came and we left the Ohio River Valley and went to the southeast, that all broke apart. That division stuff all broke apart. And because what you see in the east is towns that are named Piqua, Chillicothe in Ohio and Pennsylvania at the same time. And obviously that would have never occurred prior to that, when we were still following, that strict division, the 5 division stuff that I was talking about earlier. But what you see is that the Shawnee, one arrow is showing a group of Shawnee leaving the Ohio country right after Dunmore's war and going to Cape Girardeau area. You're seeing the group from the Cumberland River Valley leaving Kentucky and northern Tennessee prior to 1793 to go to Cape Girardeau as well. And then you're also seeing an 1812 migration of Shawnees from Alabama, who were down there among our allies, the Creeks down there. After the War of 1812, those Shawnees in those towns start migrating up into Cape Girardeau area as well. From the Cape Girardeau area, then you'll see these arrows where we're going to Kansas, and also further west in Missouri, and then eventually to Kansas. And then you'll see that green arrow shows a group of Shawnees that broke off from Missouri, the Missouri Cape Girardeau towns, and went south, eventually going into Texas. And then from Texas, they're there during the 1825, 1830s, all the way up to right before the Civil War. Then they're forced into western Oklahoma from there. And that group of Shawnees would later become known as what's known as the absentee Shawnee tribe today. And then you can see that olive green arrow shows the mixed band of Seneca Shawnees at the Lewistown Reserve, going straight from Ohio all the way to Oklahoma. That group of Shawnees never went to Cape Girardeau. They went straight from Ohio to Oklahoma with the Seneca Cayugas, who would become the Seneca Cayugas today anyway. All right, so brings us to our next slide. So these are a list of some of the important treaties between the Shawnee and the United States, and I'm just going to list them here because we're kind of short on time. If you're interested, you can do a little more research on these treaties, and there's a lot of information that you can find on these treaties. See all of the particular agreements that went on with them and all that, and who signed them. That's all on those treaties. But the first treaty between the Shawnee and the newly formed American government is in 1786 with the Treaty of Fort Finney. And then the next treaty that was a big one is that Treaty of Greenville, 1795, that I was talking about, that ended the Old Northwest Indian Wars. And then we have the Treaty of 1817, which was the first treaty after the War of 1812. And that was the treaty that established the reservations in Ohio for the Shawnee. Then we have the 1825 Treaty of St. Louis, and that's the one where we ceded the Missouri lands to establish our reservation in Kansas. Okay. On this slide, this is basically one of those cultural outreach programs that we do today, and representing, you know, a treaty signing. So that's what you see in that photo there. The next important treaties between the Shawnees and the United States are the 1831 Treaty of Lewistown, which removed the mixed band of Seneca Shawnees from Ohio to Oklahoma. Then we have the Treaty of 1831 with the Wapakoneta Shawnees, and that community, that was Blackhoof's community, moved from Ohio to Kansas. And then in 1832, there was a treaty out in basically in Oklahoma with the Senecas and the Shawnees, who were the Lewistown. They were the Lewistown bunch or band. And this treaty banded together the mixed band of Seneca Shawnees of Lewistown with the Senecas of Sandusky, which were from a reservation north of the Wyandotte Reservation in Ohio on the Sandusky River. Then in 1854, we have the treaty with the Shawnee in Kansas. This treaty establishes individual allotments of the Shawnee Reservation in Kansas. So individual families were allotted individual lands in Kansas. And then we have the 1867 treaty with the Seneca, mixed Seneca, Shawnee, Quapaw, etc. And this treaty, which was at the end of the Civil War, it actually separated the Lewistown Shawnees from the Senecas, which created the modern day Eastern Shawnee tribe of Oklahoma and the Seneca-Cayuga Nation of Oklahoma. Okay. So it is a direct result of these treaties, and what we're talking about is why today there are 3 individual Shawnee communities or Shawnee tribes that are that are in existence today, and that's these the flags that you see as the border of a lot of my slides. That's where those 3 flags come from, those 3 individual Shawnee communities. So. And that brings us to talking about those 3 individual Shawnee communities, which I'll start off first with my tribe, my community, the Shawnee tribe, which we're headquartered in Miami, Oklahoma, and our chief is Hokimont Ben Barnes. Our second chief is Roy Baldridge, and that's who you see in these photos here. Chief Barnes is on the left, and Chief Baldridge is on the right. And roughly, we have about 3,000 enrolled tribal citizens. And historically, we've also been known as the Loyal Shawnee, the Cherokee Shawnee, White Oak, and the White Oak Shawnee. And we were called Loyal Shawnee because when we were in Kansas, we were loyal to the Union and fought for the Union during the Civil War. And we were known as the Cherokee Shawnee because of that agreement in 1869, where we were where we, made the agreement to leave Kansas and to move into Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma and become adopted Cherokees. And we're known as White Oak Shawnees because White Oak is our ceremonial grounds. That's where our ceremonial grounds is in Oklahoma. So those are the 3 names that we've been known as well. And then I also listed our current tribal website for anyone interested in learning more or doing more research. And that website is subject to change in the near future because we're in the process of transferring it to a nsn.gov website. So it most likely will be the same beginning, but be nsn.gov. It'll be a .gov website. And then also I've listed on there the website for our Shawnee Tribe Culture Center. So if you want to log on to that and learn more information about the Shawnee through our Culture Center, you can do that as well. We also have a Shawnee Tribe Culture Center Facebook page as well for those interested in keeping up with that. And so what you see on the bottom is those 3 flags that I was telling you about. The blue, the Shawnee tribe flag is the tribe for my tribe, the tribe in the slide. And then you'll see the middle one is the Eastern Shawnee tribe of Oklahoma. That's their flag that they use. And then the one on the right is for the absentee Shawnee tribe of Oklahoma. That was at communities of Shawnees that had went into Texas for a portion of time before moving into Oklahoma. So next slide. The Eastern Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma are headquartered in Wyandotte, Oklahoma, and their chief is Chief Glenna Wallace and Assistant Chief Jack Ross. There are roughly 2,801 enrolled tribal citizens, and historically they have been known as the Lewistown Shawnees or the mixed band of Seneca Shawnees, as I mentioned earlier. And I've listed their tribal website if you care to, do a little further digging or investigating about them. And the third Shawnee community is the absentee Shawnee tribe, and they're headquartered in Shawnee, Oklahoma, which is kind of south of Oklahoma City. And they use the term, instead of chief, they use the term governor and lieutenant governor for chief and assistant chief. And that's all laid out, and each tribe, designates that in their tribal constitution. Every one of the tribes has its own constitution that they are governed by, and so they use the term governor and lieutenant governor. So the governor is John Johnson on the left, and their lieutenant governor is Kenneth Blanchard on the right. They have roughly 3,050 enrolled tribal members today. And historically, they've also been known as the Big Jim Band and the White Turkey Band. And I've listed their tribal website as well. Okay. So that brings me to talking about what the Shawnee communities are doing today and at this time, and also what we will be continuing to do into the future. So here I've got some photos of some ongoing cultural practices and revitalization efforts that we participate in. And with that, I would like to note that we have ceremonial observations that we still conduct at our three separate ceremonial grounds within Oklahoma today. And one, like I said, one of them is the White Oak ceremonial grounds that I was talking about earlier, and that's where we carry on our ways, our culture, our traditions. That's really, in my opinion, one of the most important things about being Shawnee is carrying on those things that we do at those ceremonial grounds. Also, we have our language preservation effort, and this last year. Our Chief Barnes of the Shawnee tribe declared a state of emergency for the Shawnee language, and with that, we're really putting a large effort into our Shawnee language and teaching it to our community members. And we have online language classes going on, and it's very important that we carry this language on because as this slide shows. Roughly now, we only have about 20 fluent Shawnee first language speakers that are alive today, and that's including all three communities. So that's a very small number, and we are in a dire necessity to make sure that our young folks learn the Shawnee language and carry it on. And this 20 fluent speakers, obviously they're elders. Majority of them are elders, and they're really at risk with what we have going on today with this COVID. And that's why it's so precarious for our communities. We cannot stand to lose one of these fluent speakers. And unfortunately, Indian country is being hit very hard with COVID. And one of the biggest concern is losing our elders who are fluent in our language, before they have a chance to pass that on. So those are something, that's something that is on our mind every day. Okay. We do hold various language classes through the Shawnee tribe, and we have various programs, and our language program coordinator and director for the Shawnee tribe is Joel Barnes, and he's doing a really good job right now on getting our online language classes going on. And so I'm very grateful to him for what he's doing. And I think my son is getting ready to start into the language classes that are getting back up and running here in the next couple of weeks. So I'm happy about that. And so what you see in this slide is some of the photos from some of those ongoing cultural revitalization efforts and practices that we do. In that middle, that's basically a stomp, what we call a stomp dance. And so that's, one of our social dances that we'll do. And it's also can be a ceremonial dance as well. But that's something that we're very active with, and we hold stomp dances and various social dances where we get together, and that's where our young kids learn how to do these things, and that's how it's passed down from generation to generation. Also, on the left hand side, you'll see a photo of a large group of Shawnees, and that was taken in 2015 when all three communities went together to Washington, D.C. For a weekend and a festival known as Shawnee Living in Both Worlds. And that's what you see on the right-hand portion of the slide is the flyer for that, which was held at the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, where we had all weekend, we had ongoing cultural presentations. We had Shawnee artists from all three of our Shawnee communities there selling their artwork or demonstrating their artwork. We had stomp dance demonstrations. We had some other songs, and one of our Eastern Shawnee tribal members, very accomplished flute player. He did some flute music for the crowds and everything. So that's what the photo on the left is, a group of the Shawnees that were there participating in those cultural practices at that Living in Both Worlds exhibit in 2015. So next slide. Again, like I was saying, we do those social dance gatherings where all three of the communities hold various cultural gatherings where the social or stomp dances are carried on and taught to our youth. These photos in here are again from that cultural outreach program that we did at Museum of the American Indian in 2015. And on the left, you'll see a group of our stomp dance leaders. And then on the right, you'll see a group of our women, what we call shell shakers. And you'll see on their lower legs, they're wearing cans that make the rhythm or keep the rhythm for us when we do these stomp dances. So that's what those photos are from. Also, I wanted to mention that we're also engaging in a lot of historic sites in our old homelands, and we are actively doing cultural outreach and cultural ambassador type programs where we are coming out to historic sites and putting on various historic programming based on some of that history that I talked about in the 1700s. And so my family is very active in that, and I've had the good fortune to bring a lot of groups of Shawnee and Delaware and Seneca Cayuga tribal members back to historic sites in Ohio, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Indiana, and do these cultural outreach programs. And so that's what you're seeing in these photos. Is on the right, that was actually a program that we did in Colonial Williamsburg a few years back, where we actually did a film about Daniel Boone and his capture by the Shawnees for what's known as Colonial Williamsburg's History in the Classroom programs that they do. So that's where that photo is taken from, and it was really cool in that we had all of the native participants in this were actual members of real Indian communities. Some were Shawnee, some were Senecas from New York, and so we were very grateful to have those folks come out and participate in that. And then also we were very grateful to have one of our fluent Shawnee speakers former governor of the absentee Shawnee tribe, George Blanchard, who you see in the middle of this photo in the black jacket. He was the language consultant for that program. And so we are very fortunate to have that happen during that time as well. On the left, that's a photo of one of our Eastern Shawnee tribal members, Talon Silverhorn, who's a very accomplished artist, musician, and there's not much that this guy can't do. And currently, at this time, he is a American Indian interpreter at Colonial Williamsburg. That's what his full-time job is. So, next slide. We're almost done here. I'm trying to wind down. I'm long-winded. So these are just some other photos from some of the other programs that we've done at Colonial Williamsburg. That's my family, my wife and kids on the bottom left. And then some of our Shawnee and Seneca Cayuga tribal members and Yuchi tribal members, and a stomp dance program that we did there at Williamsburg as well. So more pictures of cultural presentations. That's us at a maple sugaring camp, and then Talon at Colonial Williamsburg there. And my youngest son Tondi and Talon, Tondi told me that he wanted a page all to himself, so there's his slide. That was at a program at Colonial Williamsburg. My daughter wants to know why there's more pictures of Talon than her on this program. Okay. All right, which brings me to my last slide. I would be amiss if I did not mention a huge problem that we have, that the Shawnee people have, in that there are many groups of non-Indians all across the East who are claiming to be various communities or tribes of Shawnee, and they are not. A lot of research and effort has been done by our actual 3 Shawnee communities to do genealogy and vet these folks that have started up these. A lot of them are 501(c) organizations, non-for-profits, and claiming to be long lost relatives of the Shawnee people. And every one of those efforts and research on those groups have unanimously proven that they are not descendants of Shawnees. They have no Shawnee ancestors and no American Indian ancestors whatsoever. So I just wanted folks to be careful of these groups, and if you're not dealing with one of the 3 Shawnee communities that I have mentioned, you're not dealing with real Shawnees. So don't be taken advantage of. And so you can see that, there are a number of these communities or groups, which we call them CPAINs, corporations promoting themselves as American Indian, or corporations promoting themselves as American Indian nations, basically is what that CPAIN stands for. But Alabama has a group, a fake group. Illinois, Indiana has a couple. Kansas has a couple. Kentucky has a couple. Louisiana, Maryland, North Carolina, and Ohio has quite a few. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and end the presentation portion. And the last 15 minutes, I will allow for. I'll take some of these questions off of the website. I'll scroll through. And then we'll go from there. So. Yeah, you may. I'm going to scroll up through here, and you may want to repeat some of your questions if I don't get to them all. But let's see. Pass it up. Yeah, click this. One thing that I failed to mention, a recent program that I'm pretty happy with and proud that we did, was a film project in Ohio for Caesars Creek Ford Amphitheater, and that was filmed near Dayton, Ohio, at Caesar's Creek, which was an actual amphitheater where they used to have basically a play known as Blue Jacket, and it was very historically inaccurate. And so we were able to film this program about Caesar, who was an adopted African American, adopted into the Shawnee tribe, married a Shawnee woman, had Shawnee kids, and so we were able to do this film about Caesar on the grounds where Caesar actually lived, and at that amphitheater where our history had falsely been told previously. So it was very gratifying to be able to do that, and I'm very grateful to the playwright and the producer, Kane Stratton. So shout out to Kane, and one of the really cool things is that Talon Silverhorn got to play his ancestor, Chief Blue Jacket. So I think Kane may put a link in here to the video for folks that are interested in watching it. So can I minimize this so I can see the comment or questions? Yeah, all right. Trying to scroll up through here and see if there's any questions that I could answer real quick. So one question here from Ruthie Flynn family. She recently read that the Cherokees. She recently read that the Cherokee were vaccinating their fluent native speakers first. She wanted to know, are the Shawnee following this process? I do know. I don't know if the fluent language speakers are going first. Maybe Chief Barnes can chime in on that question. But I do know that the Shawnee, we are actively vaccinating our tribal members and our citizens. And I know that Chief Barnes was recently vaccinated, and so we are actively doing that. And yes, we are. So great question. So one of the questions was if the Shawnee or patrilineal, do the children follow the father's clan? Historically, yes, that was the way it was. That patrilineal descent, that's how that works. But today we've kind of gotten away from that, and that you can have members of the same family that are named into different clans, and so that's something that we've just had to adapt and change and to account for smaller numbers of Shawnees. Yeah, and as my wife said, my kids have no choice because their mother's Navajo and they're matrilineal, so my kids are Navajo and they belong to their mother's clan. So that answers that one for you. Let's see. Any other good ones here? So George would like to know more about online language classes. Okay, George, that's a good question, but these language classes are only available to actual enrolled Shawnee citizens. So you have to be an actual Shawnee Indian enrolled in one of those 3 Shawnee communities to be involved in those language classes. So one of the things that we've had to do because of these fraudulent organizations that I've mentioned on that last slide is we had to be very protective of our language material and other cultural resources, and we're very closed about that and very protective of that, because those fake communities will steal those resources and use them to promote themselves as being legit. And so because of that, we've had to adopt this policy, and it's unfortunate for folks that are genuinely interested but aren't trying to appropriate Shawnee culture. So I guess the advice I would say is for you to take it out on those fraudulent communities. Where? Scroll down here. Somebody wanted to know if this is recorded. Yes, it is being recorded, so you should be able to read it later or to watch it later. It will automatically archive on the Facebook page. So, yep, it's recorded. Have you read? I have not read the book Tecumseh and the Prophet. So the question from Mike Sheriff was, have I read that book? I have not read that one. I read primary documents, so firsthand accounts of folks that actually witnessed it. I don't read too many books that are, modern day authors writing about the Shawnee. With one consideration or one person in mind, that I do read their books, and I'll hold those books up for a recommendation for you. Really, the main person that I would recommend if anyone is wanting to get some books on Shawnee history, if you're wanting to get really historically accurate info and legit info, I would recommend the books by my friend Dr. Stephen Warren, who was also one of these presentations in September. And this is one of his books. I'll see if you guys can see it. This is one that I would recommend that you could read. I know. All right, so there's a delay in here, so I'm holding it up a little bit longer than normal. I gotta hold it up higher. How's that? There. Yeah. And here's the second book by Stephen Warren that I would recommend. And then the third book that deals specifically with the Eastern Shawnee tribe. That's the other book by Stephen Warren that I would recommend. So if you can get your hands on those three books, you'll be doing good. Okay, I think with that said, I think I will. Who? Where's he at? All right, so Mike Galvin had a question. What do the Shawnee people call themselves in our own language, which is Shawanwa? Shawanwa. That's what I said early in the very beginning, how I would introduce myself. Nila Shawanwa. I am a Shawnee. So that's how we would say it, Shawanwa. Good question. And Kane wanted to make sure that I mentioned Caesar's film, which I did. So if you guys get a chance, definitely check that out. I think Kane put a link up to it in the question section. So it's kind of a neat little 9-minute film, so worth watching. Craig had a question. He's read several Alan Eckert books, which contain Shawnee history. Does my community believe his works are accurate representations of our history? And that's a good question, and I'm going to burst your bubble, and I'm going to say no, we do not. We do not recommend any Alan Eckert books for historical accuracy. You may enjoy reading them, as a novel, but do not believe anything that you read in there, okay? Go to the Stephen Warren books that I mentioned earlier. So Shiloh Duncan said, do all three of our Shawnee communities have the same language or different dialects? That's a good question. So we have between us and absentee Shawnees, there's a little bit different dialect and pronunciation of words, and most likely that's related to the time apart from when they were in Texas for that time before coming back to Oklahoma. So that's a good question. All right. Well, with that said, I think we'll end it now. And I just want to say Nyahweh to everyone for tuning in and viewing. And I hope it's been informative. I hope you guys have learned something about the Shawnee people and our three communities. And I would encourage you to, if you're interested in learning more, to reach out to those three Shawnee communities via our Facebook or websites. So with that said, Nyahweh and Salanoki.